When you engage with someone who exhibits narcissistic tendencies, you're not engaging with a person in the traditional sense, you're engaging with a structure, a psychological scaffolding that's been meticulously built over years, often rooted in profound insecurity, deep emotional wounds, and a fundamental terror of being truly seen. What you're facing is not openness, but armor. It's not vulnerability, but performance. And the performance is designed to protect something fragile, something they themselves can barely acknowledge, the emptiness that sits at the center of an inflated sense of self. Now, when people think of narcissists, they tend to imagine arrogance, manipulation, perhaps even cruelty. But what they fail to recognize is that all of this is reactive. It's not confidence, it's compensation. It's not strength, it's camouflage. When you set a boundary with a narcissist, what you're doing is far more than drawing a line. You're engaging in a fundamental restructuring of the psychological contract that they have been imposing on you, often for years. And that contract, by its very nature, is predicated not on mutual respect, but on exploitation, on domination, on your silence and their control. So when you say no, when you say this is the line and you may not cross it, you aren't simply refusing a request. You're threatening the very framework of their existence, the illusion of superiority and control they've constructed like a fortress around a crumbling core. And make no mistake, it is crumbling. Their identity in many cases is so brittle, so devoid of authentic self-understanding, that the smallest pushback can feel like annihilation. It's crucial to understand that the narcissist is not merely seeking validation. They are hunting for control. That control often takes the shape of emotional leverage, guilt, shame, triangulation, manipulation, tools they wield with subtlety and cunning. Boundaries interrupt that process. Boundaries say, I see what you're doing, and I will not play along. And that's terrifying for them, because if you see it, you're not under the spell anymore. You're not an object anymore. You're not a source of narcissistic supply. You are a sovereign individual. And nothing frightens a narcissist more than the loss of their ability to dehumanize you for the sake of their own fragile self-worth. What often follows the setting of a boundary is a kind of psychological warfare. They might escalate, they might retreat and sulk, they might lash out, or they might pretend to comply only to violate the boundary later. They're not strategizing consciously in most cases. It's instinctual, it's survival, because boundaries expose the fact that their identity is contingent on how others treat them, perceive them, and respond to them. They need compliance to feel real. They need affirmation to believe in their own value. A boundary is like holding up a mirror and showing them the emptiness behind their performance. But to hold a boundary, you have to confront your own discomfort with conflict. And this is where people falter, particularly those who are empathetic, agreeable, or conflict avoidant. They think setting a boundary is unkind or aggressive or somehow not nice. But that belief system is exactly what narcissists exploit. That's the vulnerability they latch onto. Your desire to keep the peace, to avoid hurting others, becomes the mechanism by which they maintain power over you. So you have to ask yourself, what is the cost of your niceness? Is your peace worth sacrificing your dignity, your autonomy, your soul? Setting a boundary requires you to face that internal resistance. You have to recognize the guilt, the anxiety, the fear that arises, not because the boundary is wrong, but because you've been conditioned to equate self-protection with selfishness. You have to rewire that association. You have to teach yourself that saying no is not cruelty, it is clarity, it is integrity, it is responsibility. And if the narcissist responds with rage or manipulation or withdrawal, that's not proof that you're doing something wrong. That's confirmation that your boundary is working. Now, some people believe that setting boundaries will change the narcissist, that they will wake up, realize the harm they've done, and suddenly become a different person. That's naive. Boundaries are not a tool to change others. They are a method for preserving yourself. They are the framework within which you can rediscover your own values, your own identity, your own agency. The narcissist may never change. They may always push, always test, always resent the limits you impose. That's irrelevant. What matters is your ability to hold the line, to stop being reactive, to stop being available for their chaos. And here's the thing, every time you reinforce that boundary, you reinforce your own sense of self. Every time you choose not to engage in their drama, not to defend yourself against their distortions, not to collapse under the weight of their disapproval, you grow. You become someone who no longer needs their permission to exist. You become someone who doesn't negotiate their worth. You begin to see the manipulation not as some mysterious force, but as a desperate attempt to regain control over something they never truly owned. You. When you disengage emotionally from a narcissist, it's not merely an act of stepping back from a toxic relationship. It's an existential threat to the structure they've built to shield themselves from the unbearable reality of their own inadequacy. Emotional disengagement, at its core, is a form of psychological non-cooperation. It's the refusal to participate in the drama they orchestrate. It's the act of taking your energy, your attention, your empathy, the very fuel that powers their false self, and walking away with it. And because narcissists rely so heavily on emotional entanglement for validation, control, and identity reinforcement, your disengagement functions as a type of psychological exile. Suddenly, the stage is empty, the audience is gone, and all that's left is the silence they've spent a lifetime avoiding. You see, narcissists don't just want attention, they need it. It's not a preference, it's not a craving, it's a dependency, a parasitic relationship with others' emotional responses. And when you remove that, when you stop reacting, stop pleading, stop defending, stop explaining, you become unreadable to them. And that's deeply unsettling. Because if they can't predict you, they can't control you. If they can't get under your skin, they can't affirm their own sense of superiority. So when you emotionally disengage, you're not just denying them affection, you're denying them existence in a very real psychological sense. Their identity is no longer mirrored in your reactions. Their sense of power no longer confirmed by your suffering. And it's precisely because of this dependency that they will fight against your detachment. They'll accuse you of being cold, unfeeling, disloyal. They'll try to provoke you, bait you into responding, anything to get you to re-engage, because even negative attention is preferable to indifference. Indifference is death to the narcissistic ego. It's proof that they no longer have access to your inner world. And that loss of access is intolerable because they've built their self-concept on the illusion that they have mastery over the people around them, especially those who once cared for them deeply. What makes emotional disengagement so powerful is that it undermines the entire dynamic of power and dependency. In the typical narcissistic relationship, the compassionate, emotionally attuned individual takes on the role of the caretaker, the fixer, the emotional regulator. The narcissist leans into that. They exploit it. They learn how to push the right buttons, how to trigger guilt, obligation, pity, even hope. And for a long time, the empath stays hooked because they believe they're helping, because they think love can heal what trauma created. But eventually, the realization dawns, you're not helping someone evolve, you're enabling someone to avoid. You're not in a relationship, you're in a performance, one scripted entirely to maintain their illusion of control. And so, when you finally disengage, not out of hatred, but out of clarity, you disrupt the script, you become unpredictable, you no longer provide the emotional highs and lows that feed the narcissistic cycle, and they panic. Because without your emotional availability, they're forced to confront the internal emptiness they've spent years denying. And that confrontation is terrifying, not because they're evil necessarily, but because they are deeply, pathologically afraid of being seen for who they really are, afraid of being irrelevant, afraid of being abandoned by the very people they worked so hard to dominate. This is where many people waver. They misinterpret the narcissist's panic as vulnerability. They see the desperation, the pleas, the sudden change in tone, and they think, maybe they've changed. But what you're seeing isn't transformation, it's withdrawal. It's the reaction of someone who's just lost access to their primary source of emotional narcotic. They're not waking up to a new self. They're scrambling to restore the old dynamic. And if you go back, if you re-engage emotionally, you reinforce the pattern. You teach them that panic works. You teach them that the cycle can restart. But if you hold the line, If you remain disengaged, grounded, unreactive, you begin to reclaim a part of yourself that was surrendered long ago. Your energy returns, your clarity sharpens, your self-respect begins to rebuild. You stop asking, how can I make them see what they've done? And start asking, what made me believe I had to suffer to be loved? That's the turning point. That's the emergence of psychological independence. And while it may be invisible to others, to the narcissist, it's as if the very ground has shifted beneath them, because the person they once controlled is no longer available. The narrative no longer works. The script has been torn up, and the silence left in your wake speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who has no interest in understanding you, you shift the entire foundation of the dynamic that once held you captive. And this isn't merely a matter of communication style or strategy. It's a profound psychological withdrawal from a power structure that was never built to be fair or reciprocal. Explaining yourself to a narcissist is not about clarity. It's not about being heard. It's not about reaching mutual understanding. It's a trap disguised as dialogue. Every time you try to explain your pain, your reasoning, your decisions, or your boundaries, you're unknowingly participating in a ritual they've crafted to maintain their superiority and your subjugation. At first glance, the compulsion to explain yourself appears reasonable. You want to be understood. You want to be fair. You're taught that mature relationships are built on openness and communication. And for emotionally healthy individuals, that's true. But the narcissist isn't listening to understand. They're listening to find weakness. They're scanning for inconsistencies, for triggers, for any sign that they still have access to your emotional center. So when you explain yourself, you're not offering clarity, you're offering ammunition. You're feeding a narrative that they'll twist and use against you, sometimes immediately, sometimes later, but always with precision and intent. This cycle often begins with subtle invalidation. You express a concern or boundary and they dismiss it, call you sensitive, selfish, dramatic. You feel confused, perhaps guilty, so you try again. You reword it, soften it, hoping that a better explanation will finally land, but it never does. Because the issue was never your words. It was the imbalance of power embedded in the relationship. The narcissist has no interest in mutual understanding. They want dominance, cloaked in discourse. And each time you explain, you reinforce their frame that you owe them justification, that your thoughts and feelings must pass through their approval filter to be valid. The tragedy here is that people with a high capacity for empathy and self-reflection are often the ones caught in this web. Because you care, you want to be fair, you assume that if you can just find the right words, the truth will break through. But what you're dealing with is not a misunderstanding, it's a refusal. It's a refusal to acknowledge your humanity. And once you see that, once that realization hits you at a visceral level, the compulsion to explain begins to die. You begin to understand that withholding explanation is not cruelty, it's protection, it's boundaries, not punishment. This withdrawal often triggers a severe reaction from the narcissist. They may escalate. They may accuse you of being cold, dismissive, immature. They may demand explanations not because they want answers, but because they want the upper hand. And if that doesn't work, they might play the victim, shift the narrative. Suddenly, you're the one who's distant, the one who doesn't care, the one who won't communicate. These are pressure tactics designed to pull you back into the cycle of justification. They work because they target your sense of guilt, your identity as a thoughtful, compassionate person. But compassion without boundaries is not virtue. It's self-erasure. When you stop explaining yourself, you're not being unkind. You're acknowledging a truth that changes everything. Not everyone is entitled to your vulnerability. Not everyone deserves access to your inner life. And in toxic dynamics, explanations are not bridges, they're chains. Chains that bind you to people who see your openness as an opportunity to manipulate. So the choice to withhold explanation is not silence, it's resistance, it's strength. It's the recognition that your energy is finite and sacred and not to be spent convincing someone of your worth when their behavior has already declared you worthless in their eyes. This shift also rewires your own internal dialogue, because if you've spent years explaining yourself to someone who won't listen, chances are you've also internalized that pattern. You explain yourself to yourself. You second-guess your instincts. You rehearse conversations in your mind, imagining better ways you could have defended yourself. But once you stop explaining externally, you begin to challenge the need to explain internally. And that's when true healing begins. That's when your self-trust starts to regenerate. That's when you start to feel safe within your own boundaries, no longer looking outward for permission to exist. It's important to note that the shift is rarely clean or easy. You may feel guilt, you may feel doubt. That's normal. You're breaking a pattern that was likely reinforced for years, maybe even from childhood. You were probably taught that love means explaining, defending, being understood. But love doesn't demand endless justification. Respect doesn't require a defense. And truth doesn't need to be repeated for someone who refuses to hear it. When you stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim time, energy, and dignity that were never theirs to hold in the first place. And that reclamation, that quiet refusal, speaks more powerfully than any explanation ever could. When a narcissist begins to lose control, their perception of reality begins to crumble. Control is not simply a preference for them, it is their lifeline. Their sense of identity is built upon a foundation of domination, manipulation, and a carefully curated image that they must protect at all costs. When you remove yourself from their grip, what you're really doing is removing the mirror they use to validate their inflated sense of self. You were never seen as a separate, autonomous being. You were an extension of their ego. And when that extension is severed, they are left with something they cannot tolerate, a confrontation with their own emptiness. This unraveling doesn't happen immediately. At first, they might mask the collapse. They may feign indifference, put on a show of strength, posturing as if your absence is irrelevant. But behind that mask, something entirely different is occurring. The absence of control triggers a deep panic, but it's not the kind of panic that is easy to identify. It doesn't manifest as honest emotion. It mutates into projection, rage, grandiosity, or a frantic search for a new supply. They are not seeking connection. They are seeking another mirror, one that will reflect back to them the illusion that they are important, dominant, superior. But what they often find, especially if you are someone who gave deeply and sincerely, is that no substitute provides the same fuel, and that void becomes unbearable. The psychological architecture of a narcissist is constructed around denial. They deny their own inadequacies, their own vulnerabilities, their own emotional dependency. They bury shame so deep that even a hint of it threatens to destabilize their entire framework. When you stop feeding the illusion, they're forced to face the very things they've spent a lifetime avoiding. But they can't face it directly. Instead, they externalize it, they blame, they demonize, they rewrite the narrative to make themselves the victim and you the aggressor. Because to accept that you left due to mistreatment, that you finally drew a line after enduring cycles of emotional manipulation, would mean accepting fault. And fault leads to shame, and shame to them is annihilation. This is why their world begins to spiral. The collapse is not just about losing you. It's about the entire facade starting to crack. Their strategies become more desperate. They might try to re-engage you with kindness, apologies, false promises. Not because they've changed, but because they need the dynamic restored. And if that fails, they shift tactics, smear campaigns, lies treatments, lies. Anything to regain a semblance of control, even if it's through destruction. Their self-worth is so enmeshed with their ability to control others that losing that power feels like death. But it's a death they can't grieve properly, because grief would require acknowledgement of loss, and acknowledgement would require self-awareness. It's tempting to view their collapse as karmic justice, and on some level it is, but what's more important than their collapse is what it represents. It represents the truth that your withdrawal of energy has consequences, that the emotional labor you provided was not invisible, that the love, the tolerance, the forgiveness you extended was not weakness, it was a gift. the gift they never deserved and ultimately squandered. And once that gift is withdrawn, there is no replacing it, because what you offered was not performative, not transactional. It was rooted in real empathy, real commitment, and that kind of energy cannot be manufactured or mimicked. Their collapse is not just an emotional response, it's existential, because without someone to validate their false self, they have to face their real one. And for many narcissists, their real self is an unformed, wounded core buried beneath years of ego protection mechanisms. That's why they disintegrate, that's why they lash out, that's why they chase new people, only to repeat the cycle over and over. Because they're not evolving, they're not healing, they're fleeing, running from the very parts of themselves that need the most attention. And every failed attempt to replace what they lost only reinforces the depth of that wound. Your absence becomes a mirror, but not the kind they want. It reflects back their failure, their inability to maintain connection without control, their inability to love without domination. And while they may never admit it out loud, their behavior reveals everything. The chaos, the volatility, the desperation. These are not the responses of someone who has moved on. These are the symptoms of collapse. And though they may continue to posture, to project an image of strength and indifference, it is only a matter of time before that image shatters under the weight of its own contradiction. Because a persona built on illusion cannot withstand reality forever.